I was one of those lucky few. I remember my great-grandmother, Catherine Bannon Culrose. However, I knew her as Beanie. I was 11 years old when she died at 91. That was September 1966. When I met her, Beanie was very frail and hard of hearing. She wore a hearing aid, but I think she kept it turned off most of the time because she didn't like the noise. I think she only turned it on when the Jackie Gleason show came on, and since her hearing aid was shut off most of the time, it was nearly impossible to communicate with her. I remember when I was about 6 years old, she came to live with us in our home in Wharton, Texas. The story that I was told was that Beanie kept a boarding house on 3rd Street in Louisville. As she was getting senile, she began forgetting to collect the rent from her boarders. Plus, she loved to play the horses at Churchill Downs, and apparently, she owed a lot of money to her bookie. So, one day, my grandmother and my Uncle Bob drove up to Louisville, got her out of the house and brought her down to Houston. That house in Louisville will come up later in the story. Anyway, I think she was only with us in Wharton for a short while after Pierce died. It was shortly after that Beanie's dementia got worse and grandmother found a place for her in a nursing home up in Houston. It was called St. Anthony's, and it was nearby Hermann Park. Both my grandmother and her mother were born in Louisville, Kentucky. Their family had lived in Louisville, Kentucky, beginning in 1843, with the arrival of my great-great-grandfather, Richard Bannon, and his brother. Richard was Beanie's father. From my grandmother's stories, I knew the names and the places, but other than this, I knew very few facts about my great-grandmother's family. When I first started recording my family's history in the 1980s, I did everything on paper. I used charts that I had ordered from the LDS library. I used a pedigree chart to show 2 lines extending from myself to my mother on one side and my father on the other. Then the chart branched out to their parents and their parents. Parents and so forth. This first pedigree chart probably only had no more than 18 people on it. I also had family group sheets. I made up a family group sheet for my grandparents and for my great-grandparents. If anything, this served well to illustrate how little I knew of my family history. Sometime in the 1980s, I received a letter from a Roman Catholic nun in Kentucky. She was distantly related to me on my mother's side. She had contacted me by way of one of my grandmother's cousins who was living in Florida at the time. Cousin Betty and Bannon had learned from my grandmother and my mother of my interest in family history, and she had passed my name and address to Sister Mary Catherine. In the correspondence that followed, Sister Mary Catherine made me a nearly complete picture of the Bannon family of Louisville, Kentucky. She also provided me with maps that showed grave plots where various Bannon and Culrose family members were buried in Louisville cemeteries. This was considerably more than I previously had. I was very grateful for what the good sister gave me, but it made me realize that trying to keep all of this on paper alone would not be easy. In 1985, I made a trek to the National Archives branch in Southern California. At the National Archives, I was able to find census records for both my mother's and my father's side of the family. I was amazed at how simple this all seemed. All I had to do was look up the name and the census index, note the microfilm roll number, request the roll from the librarian, and then find the image on the microfilm. Within the first 2 hours at the National Archives, I had located the family of my great-grandmother Catherine Beanie Bannon in the U.S. Census of 1880 and the family of my great-grandfather, August DeBacker, in the U.S. Census of 1900. This is where I first learned that a great-grandmother on my father's side, Della DeBacker, had been born in Ohio. I will have a lot to say about her later. It all seems so easy, but of course, it seems so easy because I was just lucky. I knew that my father's paternal grandmother's maiden name was Gaum, at least that is how I thought it was spelled, so I figured it was only a question of looking for Gaum in the 1870 Ohio census, and I would find her family. That was my first mistake, assuming too much. I did find an Adeline Gaum, born 1867, in the 1870 census for Stark County, Ohio. She was listed as a daughter of Louis Gaum, and without so much more than that, I made the mistake of assuming that I had found my Gaum family in Ohio. More on that later. Around the time I visited the National Archives, I also visited the LDS Library in Santa Monica, California. I was unsure what I would find there, Plus, I did not know what I was doing. After a few hours of testing the waters in the LDS library, I managed to find in a book titled The History of Kentucky, a biography of my maternal great-grandfather's brother, Patrick Bannon. He had been on the city council of Louisville in the 1880s. Looking back, I realize why the Bannon family was so easy to find and trace. It was primarily because the family had a presence in the city of Louisville from the 1840s, when the Bannon brothers first arrived from Ireland, all the way down to the 1960s, when they moved my great-grandmother to Houston, Texas, and placed her in a nursing home. The family owned and ran several factories in the city, they owned houses, attended church, and many were buried there. With the information provided to me by Sister Mary Catherine, some newspaper clippings, copies of letters sent by Betty and census records, and photographs that belonged to my great-grandmother and my grandmother, I was able to put together a nearly complete history of the Bannon family in Louisville, Kentucky. That is all we have time for now. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the like button down below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Gathering More Leaves channel.